Hello and welcome to How to Use English Modal Verbs, Lesson 5, Ought, Have, and Need to with DouglasESL. What are modals? Modals are used to make requests, ask permission, or talk about ability. Modals are helping verbs that show if we believe something is probable, possible, or certain. Our first examples, number 1, I have to go to work now. Something you need to do. I have to go to work now. Number 2, you ought to buy a new TV. So you're giving advice. You ought to buy a new TV. Number 3, I need to see a doctor today. I need to see a doctor today. Ought to as advice. Example number 1, I ought to go home now. So you realize that it's time to go, so you're giving yourself advice. I ought to go home now. Ought to as an obligation. Number 2, you ought to turn off the lights when you are finished. So something you need to do. You should always turn off the lights when you're finished. So you ought to turn off the lights when you are finished. Have to as an obligation. Number 3, I have to lend you my car today. So you have to do this. You have to lend your friend your car. It's your obligation. So I have to lend you my car today. Need. Something is necessary. Number 2, I need to get some gas for my car. Without gas, your car will not run. So it's a necessity. It's necessary. I need to get some gas for my car. More example sentences. Number 1, I do not need to drive today. So maybe you're not working, but you don't need to. I do not need to drive today. Number 2, I ought to buy some water. Ought to. I ought to buy some water. Number 3, she needs to bring her computer to class. So she's obligated, something she has to do. She needs to bring her computer to class. Number 4, we ought to pay the fee now. We ought to pay the fee now. Number 5, I have to go home now. So it's an obligation. It's time to go. I have to go home now. And finally, number 6, I have to be in Atlanta on Wednesday. Maybe you have a business appointment. I have to be in Atlanta on Wednesday. It's time for our modal assessment. Please choose the correct modal. I'll read the sentences. Number 1, she to go back soon. Number 2, you to drive safe. Number 3, he to eat more vegetables. Number 4, I to be at work now. Number 5, she to be at 7 a.m. And finally, number 6, you to save money. Please select the correct modal and pause the video if you need more time. Okay, let's see what the answers are. Number 1, she ought to go back soon. So she ought to go back soon. So you're giving them good advice. She ought to go back soon. Number 2, you ought to drive safe. We all should drive safe. You ought to drive safe. Number 3, he needs to eat more vegetables. We all need to eat more vegetables, but you're saying to your friend, he needs to eat more vegetables. Number 4 could really be both. I need to be at work now, or I ought to be at work now. Basically have the same meaning. It's something that you're obligated or you need to do. I need to be at work now, or I ought to be at work now. Number 5, she needs to be at 7 a.m. She needs to. And finally, number 6, you ought to or need to save money as advice. Both have the same meaning. You can use either phrase. You ought to save money or you need to save money. Okay, well, thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share to hear more English videos in the future. Thank you for watching Douglas ESL.